a brief, luminous moment, it felt as though the Forrester empire had been given a second chance. After weeks of uncertainty, internal conflict, and public scandal, Eric Forrester stood once again at the helm of Forrester Creations. The boardroom that had so recently echoed with tension now rang with cautious applause when he announced his return to active leadership. Ridge had been the one to urge him most fervently, appealing not only to his authority but to his legacy. Steffi had followed, arguing that the company needed stability, needed the symbolic strength of its founder to steady investors and silence critics. Even Brooke, despite her private anxieties about Eric's recent vulnerabilities, had acknowledged that no one embodied the brand more completely. Eric had resisted at first. He had claimed fatigue, a desire to step back, to reflect. But beneath that reluctance lay something deeper: guilt. The shadow of Sheila's accusation, the public spectacle, the unresolved questions about his judgment had shaken him more than he cared to admit. Yet the thought of watching his life's work drift into chaos proved unbearable. When he finally agreed to return, hope rippled through the family like sunlight breaking through clouds. The following morning, Forrester Creations buzzed with renewed purpose. Designers moved with sharper focus. Assistants spoke in optimistic tones. Eric arrived early, his posture dignified, his presence commanding in a way that reminded everyone why the empire bore his name. He moved through the corridors slowly, absorbing the energy of the place he had built from sketches and dreams decades ago. When he entered his office, he paused, running his fingers across the polished desk as though grounding himself in familiarity. Ridge watched from the doorway with quiet relief. For all their disagreements, he had never stopped believing that his father's guidance was irreplaceable. Steffi, too, felt steadier knowing Eric occupied the office that symbolized continuity. But by mid-morning, something shifted. Eric had scheduled a brief meeting with the legal department and requested privacy afterward. No one questioned it. It was typical of him to carve out solitary time when making strategic decisions. Yet as the hours passed, unease crept through the executive floor. It was Steffi who noticed first. She had gone to retrieve her father for a board call, expecting to find him reviewing contracts or sketching revisions. Instead, she found the office door slightly ajar and the room disturbingly still. Eric was not there. At first, she assumed he had stepped out briefly. But then her eyes registered details that unsettled her deeply. A cup of coffee lay tipped over on the desk, dark liquid bleeding across papers. Eric despised disorder. He was meticulous to the point of ritual. Important files lay scattered, as though someone had rifled through them in haste. A chair was slightly askew. The atmosphere felt wrong. Steffi's pulse quickened as she called Ridge. Within minutes he was standing beside her, scanning the room with a sharp, assessing gaze. The scene contradicted everything they knew about Eric's habits. This was not a man who left chaos in his wake. Then they saw the envelope on the desk. Inside was a short letter, written in Eric's unmistakable handwriting. The message was brief, almost sterile. He claimed he needed time alone to think. He urged them not to search for him. He promised he would return when clarity found him. Ridge read it twice. It sounded like Eric, but it did not feel like him. The spilled coffee, the scattered papers, the abrupt disappearance without notifying anyone personally. It contradicted his character. Steffi's instincts flared into alarm. She immediately requested security footage from the building entrance. Ridge ordered a trace on Eric's phone, ignoring the legal implications in favor of urgency. The last outgoing call had been placed minutes before his disappearance. The number traced back to Ivy Forrester. The name alone sent a shock through the room. Ridge's expression darkened. Ivy had always carried a complicated history within the family. Resentful at times, ambitious, quietly observant. But kidnapping? Manipulation? It seemed extreme. Then the call recording arrived. As the audio played, Eric's voice sounded calm but guarded. Ivy's tone, however, carried a softness edged with something sharper. She had requested a private conversation regarding family matters. Her final words were followed by a faint sound in the background. A low, almost playful laugh. Not hysterical, not loud, but unmistakably calculating. Steffi felt the blood drain from her face. It was not coincidence. Within the hour, Ivy herself appeared at Forrester Creations. She entered the lobby with composure that bordered on theatrical. Employees whispered as she passed. Ridge and Steffi confronted her before she reached the elevators. She did not deny the call. Instead, she delivered her revelation with chilling clarity. Yes, she had arranged for Eric to leave. Yes, she had facilitated circumstances that ensured his disappearance would trigger panic. And yes, she had done so deliberately. Her motive, she explained, was not chaos for its own sake but correction. For years she had watched the Forrester legacy concentrate power among the same inner circle. She had witnessed favoritism, betrayal, and what she believed to be unjust exclusion of branches of the family tree. Eric, in her view, had allowed sentiment to dictate leadership rather than strategy. By removing him temporarily, she claimed she was forcing the company into necessary transition. Ridge's anger ignited instantly. He accused her of criminal manipulation, of exploiting familial ties for personal vendetta. Steffi's fury was colder, more focused. She demanded to know where Eric was. Ivy did not provide a direct answer. Instead, she produced documentation. A temporary power of attorney. Signed by Eric. Ridge's hands trembled as he examined it. The signature appeared authentic. The language authorized Ivy to oversee operations in his absence. Steffi's disbelief deepened into dread. Had Eric signed it willingly? Had he been coerced, drugged, threatened? Ivy insisted that Eric had come to recognize the need for broader leadership representation. She framed herself not as usurper but as steward acting on his quiet request. Her voice remained composed, but beneath it lingered satisfaction. The board was summoned in emergency session. Panic spread through the executive ranks. Investors demanded reassurance. The media began speculating wildly about Eric's sudden departure. Forrester Creations, once buoyed by Eric's return, plunged into instability overnight. Ridge struggled to maintain control. He challenged the legality of the document, contacted attorneys, requested immediate forensic analysis of the signature. Steffi worked feverishly to reassure key partners that operations would not halt. But Ivy's presence at headquarters felt like an occupation. She took Eric's chair. She reviewed files. She issued directives in measured tones, citing the authority granted to her. To the employees, she presented herself as decisive, prepared, necessary. To Ridge and Steffi, she was an intruder wielding technical legitimacy. Meanwhile, Eric sat in darkness. The room in which he was held was not overtly brutal. It was clean, minimally furnished, windowless. But its simplicity was suffocating. The door was locked from the outside. His phone was gone. The only light came from a single overhead fixture that hummed faintly. He had not been physically harmed. But he had been deceived. Ivy had approached him privately that morning, claiming urgency. She had spoken of threats to the company's future, of fractures within the family. She had persuaded him to sign a temporary authorization document under the guise of strategic confidentiality. Only afterward had he realized the trap. When he attempted to leave, the door had been locked. Now, alone in the room, he replayed her words. He felt not only anger but shame. He had underestimated her resentment. He had believed that blood ensured loyalty. He stood and tested the door again. It did not yield. Back at headquarters, the Forrester family reeled under the revelation that their patriarch had been reduced to a pawn in a calculated act of revenge. Brooke arrived mid-afternoon, her expression stricken as she absorbed the news. The emotional whiplash, from celebration to disappearance, felt surreal. She demanded immediate police involvement. Ridge hesitated only briefly before agreeing. Family pride no longer outweighed urgency. As authorities began tracing Ivy's movements, Ivy herself maintained unflinching composure. She assured them that Eric was safe. She insisted he would return when the company had stabilized under her interim guidance. Her words were smooth, but her eyes betrayed triumph. In the final moments of the episode, the camera returned to the hidden room. Eric sat on the edge of a narrow bed, his shoulders heavy yet his eyes resolute. He was not a helpless man. He was the architect of empires. And though he had been trapped, he was not defeated. He examined the room carefully, searching for weakness, for opportunity. Outside, in her newly claimed office, Ivy leaned back in Eric's chair and allowed herself a slow, satisfied smile. The empire that had once excluded her now trembled under her control. But in the shadows, Eric rose to his feet once more, testing the limits of captivity. The war for Forrester Creations had only just begun. Night fell over Los Angeles with deceptive calm. But inside Forrester Creations the air felt electric, charged with anxiety and suspicion. The once harmonious rhythm of the design floor had fractured into murmurs and hurried glances. Assistants whispered in corridors. Executives avoided eye contact. Every email carried an undercurrent of uncertainty. The company had survived corporate takeovers and romantic scandals, but this felt different. This felt surgical, calculated. In Eric's office, no, in Ivy's office now, the atmosphere was unnervingly composed. She had rearranged nothing, almost deliberately preserving the familiar layout as if to assert that her authority required no cosmetic change. Eric's leather chair remained behind the desk, and she occupied it without apology. Her movements were measured, her tone even as she issued directives to department heads. She spoke of stability, of honoring Eric's vision, of safeguarding the company through temporary transition. The words were carefully chosen. She did not present herself as conqueror but as caretaker. Yet beneath the polish, satisfaction simmered. Ridge watched from the doorway at one point, his expression unreadable but burning. He had always underestimated Ivy's capacity for long-term strategy. She had never been the loudest voice in the room. She had never demanded center stage. And now he understood that silence had not been submission, it had been calculation. Steffi, meanwhile, refused to remain reactive. While Ridge confronted legal teams to challenge the authenticity of the power of attorney document, Steffi worked behind the scenes. She called in favors from security consultants, demanded access to building surveillance from the morning Eric vanished, and insisted that the police treat the matter not as voluntary disappearance but as unlawful detainment. She refused to let Ivy's narrative of temporary retreat take root. The more footage they reviewed, the more unsettling the pattern became. Cameras showed Eric entering his office alone. Minutes later, Ivy entered through a side corridor rarely used by executives. The feed from Eric's hallway camera cut out for a span of 9 minutes. Just long enough to conceal something critical. When the footage resumed, Ivy exited alone. Steffi's pulse pounded as she replayed the blank screen over and over. It was not coincidence. Meanwhile, in the hidden room where Eric was held, time blurred. There were no windows, no clocks, no external markers. But Eric refused to surrender to passivity. He had built an empire from instinct and endurance. Captivity would not reduce him to fragility. He examined the room repeatedly, noting the seams of the door, the pattern of the hinges, the faint vibration of air through the vent above. He tested the handle again, more carefully this time. It was reinforced but not industrial. He shifted his focus to the vent. It was secured by screws, not welded. If he could find something to leverage them loose, there might be a chance. On the small desk in the room sat a pen and a thin metal lamp base. He examined the base slowly, weighing its sturdiness. His mind, once dulled by betrayal, sharpened into strategy. Back at Forrester Creations, Brooke arrived with a different kind of urgency. Unlike Ridge and Steffi, her instincts leaned toward psychological warfare. She knew Ivy's history, her resentment, her quiet rivalry, her sense of exclusion. Brooke believed this was not merely about corporate control. It was about legacy, about a perceived imbalance in how the Forrester name had been distributed among heirs. Brooke confronted Ivy privately. The exchange was icy but civil. Brooke questioned the morality of using Eric's vulnerability as leverage. Ivy responded calmly, suggesting that Eric's vulnerability had existed long before her intervention. She implied that Ridge's dominance had suffocated alternative leadership voices. She insisted she had acted to protect the company from insular stagnation. Brooke recognized the manipulation. Ivy was reframing abduction as reform. But Brooke also sensed something else beneath Ivy's composure, a flicker of insecurity. Ivy wanted acknowledgement. She wanted validation that she had been overlooked. That insight would matter later. The board meeting that afternoon descended into near chaos. Several members expressed concern about legal liability should Eric's absence be deemed involuntary. Others feared public relations disaster if word of kidnapping surfaced. Investors were already jittery from recent scandals involving Sheila and the contested paternity claims. The empire felt besieged from every angle. Ridge took the floor and made a decisive declaration. Until Eric was physically present and publicly confirmed his intentions, no long-term structural changes would be enacted. Ivy's authority, he insisted, would be limited to operational continuity only. No mergers, no share transfers, no executive firings. Ivy smiled faintly at the restriction, as though she had anticipated it. Continuity, she said softly, is all I require. Her confidence unsettled them. Hours later, the police delivered preliminary findings. The signature on the power of attorney document appeared authentic. There were no immediate signs of forgery. But authenticity did not eliminate coercion. Steffi refused to accept stagnation. She returned to the footage room and examined the cut feed again. This time she noticed something subtle. The timestamp glitching slightly at the moment of interruption. Not a total blackout. A manual override. That meant inside access. Someone had assisted Ivy. The realization widened the scope of betrayal. Meanwhile, in captivity, Eric had begun his own quiet rebellion. Using the metal base of the lamp, he loosened the vent screws one by one, careful to move slowly to avoid drawing attention. Sweat gathered at his brow, but determination steadied his hands. Each metallic click of a screw releasing felt like a small victory. He did not know where the vent led. But it was movement, and movement was hope. Back at headquarters, Steffi cross-referenced the security override log. One name appeared near the timestamp. An IT technician recently transferred from a subsidiary firm partially owned by Ivy's extended branch of the family. The pieces aligned. Ridge's anger transformed into strategic focus. If Ivy had accomplices within the company, her influence extended deeper than anticipated. That evening, Ivy returned to Eric's office after most employees had left. She stood before the large window overlooking the city skyline, hands clasped behind her back. For the first time, she allowed her composure to soften into reflection. She did not view herself as villain. In her mind, she had been marginalized. Decisions had been made without her voice. Opportunities diverted. Recognition diluted. Eric had praised her loyalty yet consistently favored Ridge's lineage in leadership matters. This was not vengeance, she told herself. It was correction. Yet beneath that rationalization lingered something darker. A satisfaction at watching Ridge and Steffi scramble. Her phone vibrated. A short message from the hidden location. He's restless. Ivy's smile thinned. Ensure he remains comfortable, she typed back. In the concealed room, Eric finally freed the last vent screw. The metal panel loosened with a faint scrape. He removed it carefully and peered into the narrow shaft. It was tight but navigable. He did not hesitate, lowering himself onto the desk. He reached upward and pulled his body into the vent, wincing at the confined space. The metal edges scraped against his suit jacket, but he pushed forward, inch by inch. Freedom was not guaranteed, but stagnation was unacceptable. Back at the mansion, Brooke sat alone in the dim living room, staring at family portraits. So many crises had struck the Forresters over the years. Romantic betrayals, corporate rivalries, near deaths. Yet this felt uniquely intimate. Eric had not simply been attacked externally. He had been exploited from within the family's extended branches. Her thoughts returned to Ivy's subtle need for validation. Brooke realized something crucial. Ivy's plan depended on narrative. If the public perceived her as reformer rather than criminal, she could maintain control. The next move would need to dismantle that narrative. The episode closed with parallel tension. In the corporate tower, Ivy stood in Eric's office. Her silhouette framed against city lights. Confident in her calculated ascendancy. In the dark ventilation shaft, Eric crawled forward through metal confinement. Breath controlled. Resolve unbroken. And in the security monitoring room, Steffi stared at the screen displaying the glitch timestamp, whispering to Ridge that the war for their empire was no longer about paperwork. It was about rescue. As the camera pulled back, the Forrester empire stood balanced between captivity and rebellion, manipulation and exposure. And somewhere within the walls of a hidden corridor, a single loose screw clattered faintly to the floor.